Hello, and welcome to the Identity Paradox Inside the Racial Pharmacon, a podcast examining anti-racist theories and practices aimed at dismantling destructive identitarian politics and ideologies, both in the US and abroad. Please note that discussions deal with very difficult subject matter, so every episode comes with a general content warning.
And I'm your host, Carlos Gallego, Associate Professor of English, as well as both Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Humanities here at St. Olaf College. This podcast is part of the programming brought to you by the Bolt Chair Endowment, so special thanks to the Bolt family for making this programming possible. If you enjoyed today's podcast, make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And now, the show.
Hello and welcome to the Identity Paradox. I'm your host, Carlos Gallego, and this is part 2 of our conversation with David Neiwert, already in progress.
Of their freaking lives by that event. And that's what happens with conspiracism and conspiracy theories. When this stuff comes, when people act out on this stuff, it just has powerfully devastating effects. So yeah, it's really troubling that we are so institutionally incapable of recognizing what's happening to us.
And just along those points, I do want to put on my literary critic hat for just a second, because the way I read this, I found it to be extremely interesting. And I'm sorry I skipped this paragraph because I was very impressed by the way you start this book and the prologue, because you do start with the Stephen Paddock Las Vegas shooting, and it's an epigraph. It's just him, basically, you're quoting him saying like it's time for America to wake up, which is essentially the purpose of the red pill, to wake Neo up in the film The Matrix. So the idea of waking America, which is interesting because then you compare that to woke culture and like, which waking up do we want? What reality do we want to wake up to? Right? Exactly. So you start with the epigraph, and then you offer evidence by offering the anonymous quote online in terms of someone basically going online and venting about like, this is my reality. And I think it gives us an insight into someone who's alienated, asking questions, is vulnerable, is at that point. You follow that up with a brief analysis and then the foreboding details around Lane Davis's early years, who would be the right-wing online figure who would end up killing his father in Washington, correct? So the way I see it, it's almost like, and this is a lit crit hat speaking, the opening pages read as if you're formally replicating the avalanche effect you've been documenting for over a decade and condensing it into that prologue, almost to give the reader a sense of like one thing after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other, and it all culminates in this thing now that's a phenomena that cannot be denied as hate talk in the eliminations. Now we're going to like hate crimes and the violence they spur type of thing. That accurate reading is very powerful.
No, in fact, I would say the genesis of Red Pill Blue Pill was me thinking about, after I'd written Alt America, what can I do next in terms of trying to explain this to people, because the book was my most successful book, but didn't feel like the message was penetrating. Certainly I don't hear, I hear a lot of people remark in wonder about, oh gosh, these guys live in an alternative universe. And I go, yeah, I wrote a whole book about that.
Which is the alt part in so many ways, right?
That's what it is. It's exactly, it's in the title.
What do you think alt means? And that's what strikes me. It's very frustrating. We can talk about that a little bit later, because it's frustrating to me on two fronts. It's frustrating that people are coming to terms, are working through their own personal denial and recognizing the reality of authoritarianism in the United States as a reality now, not as a possibility now, and that you're not a crazy extremist conspiracist yourself for saying so, or alarmist.
That's what I got dismissed as for a lot of years, as an alarmist, and I was reporting facts.
And you were reporting facts, which is interesting because you are doing investigative reporting. I mean, you're in the scene. You're talking to the people in these cultures, which amazes you survive all those cultures and all those talks. But I'm sure growing up in Idaho helped, because you know the parlance, how to read the room and stuff like that. Stuff that I probably couldn't get away to read. Who knows exactly? I just smile a lot and stand really tall. So, but the point being that the other thing that frustrates me is that and other people like I don't speak German. I know you've been on that podcast with Daniel and Jack, and they talk about it a little bit. One of the things that a lot of us find frustrating is that there's a lot of overlap for points of agreement between some of these alienated working class people that fall victims to these red pills and people who don't fall victim to the red pills, but agree that a lot of the same problems that these people are complaining about are not wrong, that they're not mistaken or irrational by calling attention to the problems that exist. What is borderline irrational, if not completely irrational, is their idea of a solution to some of those problems, right? And so I want to come back to that because I find that really, really frustrating. But the one thing I just want to make sure that we agree on, Trump normalized psychopathic or sociopathic authoritarianism in this country. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, it's why, I mean, yeah, there a lot of the reason we see a lot of these videos of this sort of ugly behavior popping up is the fact that everybody has a phone now, but I think it's a lot more than that. I think that there's, I think he took the lid off of our national lid.
Yeah.
And all the creepy crawlies came flying out. And I don't think we're putting the lid back on anytime soon.
Have you written any poetry, David? Because
lid
and id rhyme, so I would just start with that. You never know. You can write political poetry somewhere. So basically, we've gone from the threat of fascism emerging in this country in the sense of like it can happen here to like now we're living with fascism in this country, and it might get worse down the line. Like in 2024, we might get a Tucker Carlson or a Cotton or someone else that may not be as immediately repulsive to some people as Trump is, who can come across as a little more charismatic and convincing in their quote unquote rational reasons for why they want to govern the way they govern. Is that a possibility, do you think? Or?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the Democratic guardrails are still holding, which is why we don't have, even during the Trump years, we didn't have fascism in the office, in power. But what he was doing was tearing down those Democratic guardrails. I think that somebody like Carlson, somebody who's charismatic enough might be able to pull it off. Or at least, become the figurehead for the movement. Because I don't know how long Trump is with us, but I do think, the thing about authoritarianism is that it is a natural impulse, that it arises out of the natural desire for security. And everybody has some authoritarian impulses. Everybody has those strands in our personalities. We all have that desire for security, but where authoritarianism goes is that it makes, well, first of all, it builds on fearfulness. So the more fearfulness you have in the environment, the greater the sort of authoritarian response becomes in the general public. That's really kind of the fuel of authoritarianism, is spreading as much fear as you can. And that's why I really think that this, I started seeing the real trend towards authoritarianism beginning after 9/11. And it just built, and it just built from there. And now it's become this overwhelming threat. And one of the ways we can think about this that I think is important is that the heroic myth is really central to authoritarianism, or the dynamics of the heroism. I'll just say every single right-wing extremist I ever knew and have spent time with sees themselves as heroic. Certainly everybody who was at the Capitol on January 6th saw themselves as heroic, as well as, people like Dylan Roof and Anders Breivik and people like that. They all see themselves as heroes out to save the world, Shauna Ford particularly. was another one who saw herself in heroic terms. And that's because being a hero, being a hero is really central to right-wing politics and the far-right politics and the dynamic. And that's the desire to be a hero is really central to its appeal. That's what, why conspiracy theories give you a sense of empowerment, is that they make you feel like you can be a hero in your own action movie. You're getting the secret knowledge that nobody else is. And it's certainly central to, when I've spent a lot of time with Proud Boys and their folks over the last 4 years, and they all, again, believe that they're being heroic and that they're saving the world from commies and Antifa and whatever, and BLM. And I know that this has arisen. I saw all the appeals to heroism that the Oath Keepers were making back in 2009 and 11 in the context of the Tea Party. And it's really fundamentally the same thing. One of the keys to this dynamic is that being heroic requires an enemy. If you're going to make yourself out to be a hero, you have to have an enemy. That's all heroes have enemies. And so a lot of the enterprise of being a right-wing extremist involves creating enemies, naming enemies. In the 50s it was commies, and in our current milieu, it's Antifa and BLM that they have concocted this enemy of. And back in the Tea Party, it was immigrants and Muslims who were the concocted enemy. And that's so really generating and reifying enemies is really central to the whole far right dynamic. There's a reason that, Umberto Eco, in his kind of, I think, seminal essay on fascism, listed some 14, I think, attributes of fascism. And, he did this from a historical knowledge basis. And it's a great essay. It's called Fascism. But one of these, and I think one of the most important ones, is that he says, in fascist society, everyone is educated to be a hero. And I think about our current culture, where superhero movies are far and away the most popular genre, where we play video games like Call of Duty and stuff like that are all about being a hero. We're really generating a culture that is very conducive to what I would call fascist trends and fascist strains of thought, and we're really vulnerable to it. So
and it's interesting because one of the defining characteristics of fascism is when the aesthetic or the form takes over the content of the politics, right? And the form dictates much of the politics. And I see this a lot.
It's an aesthetic of violence.
Aesthetic of violence. Thank you. And I noticed you also referenced the Paxson book. It's like, wow, he's read Berger and Paxson. I'm going to stop checking. Stop checking what David's referencing. All those guys.
Yeah, I had Paxson and I did put together, and a couple of other fascist scholars put together a refutation of Jonah Goldberg's liberal fascism back in 2009. You can find it on History Channel, I think. Yeah,
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, History News Network. History Network.
Okay, I'll definitely have to check that out because I found that extremely interesting.
Yeah. The scholars just kind of dismantled him.
But you see this in the LARPing, right? The live action role playing that some of these people actually attend these events, and you saw this with the Christ shooter in terms of, you talked about this really well in your book, in terms of like filming it as if it's a video game, living it as if it's a video game, even when lives are at stake.
Did you see any of the footage from?
I saw some of it, but I couldn't bring myself to watch the whole thing.
I couldn't watch any more than about 45 seconds of it.
Exactly. It's just too in your face.
It was like watching somebody play Doom.
Yep. And this recruits people.
It does.
And people like you and me can't watch more than 45 because we understand we're on the verge of watching a snuff film. Whereas other people watch it and are like, oh, that's how you get recognition, attention, heroic status within society, is by enacting some of this.
They don't understand what's happening to them when they're watching that. Robert J. Lifton's written a lot about this in terms of cults and authoritarian cults, about how, he wrote a great book about 9/11 called Superpower Syndrome, where he theorized that basically the whole nation was traumatized, psychologically traumatized, psychiatrically traumatized by 9/11, because we all watched that video of those planes going into those towers. And we all watched the video of people jumping out of those buildings. And that stuff traumatizes people. And it makes us fearful. It does all those things. It sets us up for authoritarianism.
Which is interesting, because in your chapter on sacrifices, I found really powerful, especially the way you keep repeating the one sentence word sacrifices throughout the entire chapter as a way of highlighting, like, another life, another life, another life. And to you, these are all connected by motive. So this whole frustration underlying the Las Vegas Police Department investigation of Paddock, and saying, we know the where, the when, the how, and the what we don't know is the why. And people like you and me are saying, like, it's right there. There's a breadcrumb trail leading to the motive. They're being radicalized. There's these cultures encouraging people like Paddock to go out acting alone, which makes the lone shooter thesis for me extremely weak, because I understand they're acting alone, but they're acting alone within the context of a culture that is no longer physical communities. They are online communities that are perpetrating, even training people how to do this kind of stuff.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the whole idea of the lone wolf is wildly misunderstood.
Yeah.
You hear media folks toss that term out, and it becomes a way of depicting these incidents as isolated incidents. It was just an isolated incident.
Yeah, exactly.
But in fact, the lone wolf is a specific strategy that was developed by a neo-Nazi named Louis Beam in the late 1980s. He was with the Aryan nations in northern Idaho, and he came up with this, what he called leaderless resistance strategy. And it had two components. One was to form small action cells, aka militias, and that became the militia movement. I mean, this is actually a really sort of this essay on leaderless resistance was really central. Had a really important genesis point for a lot of right-wing extremism we saw afterwards, because there was the small cells action that basically became the militia cells of the 1990s, and they were specifically based on Beam's ideas of leaderless resistance, as well as what he called the lone wolf. And he had a good example at the time that was actually wildly popular with the radical right. And that was the case of Joseph Paul Franklin, who was an assassin who wandered the country. He was the guy who shot Vernon Jordan. He was the guy, he shot mixed race couples all around the country with a sniper rifle. And they finally caught him and put him on death row, and he was put to death a few years ago in Missouri. And but the guy who wrote the Turner Diaries followed up his sort of sequel to it.
Pierce?
William Pierce. Yeah, William Pierce. His sequel to the Turner Diaries was a book called Hunter. That was basically
that's right.
a lone wolf book based on Joseph Paul Franklin.
Wow.
And so, it's basically the idea is that the lone wolves, if the lone wolves can go out and not have any organizational ties that will bring down the rest of the movement, that's the best thing, because they can wreak all this havoc and have this same terroristic effect of tearing down the public's feeling of security and safety that the government is supposed to be providing. If they can tear that down, that's what they want. Right. And that was the whole point of the lone wolf strategy. So all these actors, including guys like Dylan Roof, who act out as lone wolves, were actually acting out as part of a specific strategy that the radical right, that right-wing extremists have had in place for 25 years.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the way I think of it all the time is like, even lone wolves are raised in packs. and you can't take that away from them. So that pack mentality and
That's right.
leaving a pack to start your own pack or whatever the reasons are, that there you cannot separate the wolf from the pack. At some point they were influenced by someone for some reason. So that's important to keep in mind, I think, in terms of like de-romanticizing the notion of what a lone shooter or a lone wolf is in terms of
Yeah, it's not just an isolated incident. I
Yeah.
mean, there have been some isolated incidents. There was of mass shootings, only one or two that I was able to find. There was a church shooting down in Texas where it appeared eventually, I think the conclusion was that it was a sort of a familial slash church dispute where he walked into the church and just shut down because he was a member of the church. There wasn't any political motivation we could find, or even any conspiracy theories. But that was a rare case. Almost every mass shooting that I have looked at over the last 20 years has involved somebody who's been consumed by conspiracy theories.
I'm same with me, which brings me to the chapter on rabbit holes, which I found the most interesting, because that's where you kind of bring out the psychology. And I think one of the key terms that you introduce in that chapter is the concept of alienation, and how most of these people that fall victim to rabbit holes are people that in one degree or another are suffering from some form of alienation, that they're
profound alienation.
And that they're looking to resolve, that they're looking for some kind of answer to. So you referred to the political scientist Joseph Usinski in explaining how the epistemology of the conspiracist is essentially an unhealthy one due to the resistance to what many of us literally call common knowledge, right? Or common sense knowledge, or we agree to be common knowledge. Usinski mentions parameters in describing this pathological, I call it a pathological epistemology. One the psychologist that you quote, Stephen Lewandowski, describes in terms of conspiracist ideation. In other words, there are parameters on what is knowable and unknowable in this alternative reality, which are often determined by alternative facts and what I call ideological fantasies. So my question or my request is, could you please elaborate?
I would add that these are frequently shared violent fantasies.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you if you could elaborate on why epistemological parameters or those boundaries and the role of fantasy are so important to conspiracist ideation and so crucial to understanding the red pill or rabbit hole effect. Like why those specific ideas of parameters and having specific boundaries are important.
Right. Well, it's why I would say we're in an epistemic crisis right now, is that epistemology being how we know the world, essentially the science or the logic of how we know the world, has been really shattered by the whole conspiracy theory universe, because they are constantly throwing out stuff. And as you mentioned, conspiracy theories up to and really through the early 90s and through 9/11 were always based on real things that they, real sort of frequently seemingly contradictory evidence or whatever, or anomalistic evidence. And but beginning somewhere around, like you said, around when Obama was elected, they just went completely off the rails and basically started just pulling crap out of their butts. That's just that. There's no other way to describe it. No. Just concocting it out of whole cloth. Okay, let's put a nice academic phrase on it, but that's fundamentally what they were doing, and now that's just common. That's where almost all of these, what they do is they come up with things that what they'll do is lie and say, is the reason that COVID is spreading, right? And of course, that if you actually look at it, is a complete and utter falsehood. But once they utter it, they have a whole audience. And as they say, lie can fly around the world 3 times before the truth can get its boots on. And that's truly the case with how the whole conspiracist universe works, is that they just throw garbage out there into the information stream. And people gullibly buy into it, partly because it's not the official story. I mean, it's this really sort of bizarre reverse gullibility, where they see themselves as being skeptical, hyper skeptical of things, and can see into the real reality. But actually their skepticism of it doesn't extend to the conspiracy garbage that's being thrown out there. They're not skeptical of that stuff at all.
Which is, I find that incredibly ironic, and I want to talk about in a second. But what I find interesting is that the programming is literally meant to program people who are dissatisfied with their current software and want different software implemented into their
quote-unquote hardware. They need to have basically a different mechanism for how they know the world.
Exactly.
So it's their new epistemology. But it is, as you say, it's a pathological epistemology.
It's their Windows 11, I guess, basically, which I refuse to update to at the moment. Because I'm afraid of what it's going to do, and nothing's going to work if I do that. So I'm just staying away from
blue screen of death.
Congratulations, and that's all it's going to say for like ever. So that brings me, in many ways, segues to the Chaos by Design chapter, which I found incredibly informative and scary, because I had no idea about, and I'm going to call it this, YouTube's accelerationist algorithm. That is very, very scary, because basically the argument you're making, or not the argument, the research you're providing in that chapter is to demonstrate that even though YouTube doesn't want to give us access to what that algorithm is, that algorithm, when you watch it, if you're curious, in other words, anyone who's either intellectually curious or alienated and wanting different software, both of those people could fall victim to the rabbit hole effect by watching a YouTube video and not being attentive to what they're watching in the moment. Because as we know, YouTube videos will quickly transition from the end of one video to 5 seconds, and then the next video starts. And what you highlight in that chapter is that the next video is always going to be a more intense version of the previous video's content. So that by the time you get into 5 videos into it, you are being essentially accelerated in terms of your radicalization, simply based on an algorithm that YouTube has as part of its general platform. Is that
right?
Accurate?
And what makes a video become part of that algorithm, what makes it controversial, or basically the metric that they use is engagement. If a video has received a lot of engagement on a particular topic, then that becomes a video that will then be recommended by the algorithm, because that's what the algorithm's looking for. Oh, you like this subject? Well, here's a video that got a lot of engagement on this same subject, right? That's their thinking. But what engagement means typically on social media platforms, and it isn't just YouTube, and we'll talk about Facebook here in a minute, but YouTube's particularly toxic because the video platform is so potent in terms of radicalizing people and making them believe that they're obtaining new knowledge that's actually 90% bogus. And and video's great for doing that, but
lots of evidence.
But so this whole engagement concept is what all of these social media platforms use as the basis of their algorithms. And the whole idea is that they want to keep you using their website, right? That's its profit motive. But in the process, what they're doing is that they are actually engaging, or actually fomenting conspiracist controversy, because a lot of the engagement is the result of the controversy that a particular conspiratorial or conspiracist video will put up. And so it has the effect, as it did with Dylan Roof, of drawing people down into this rabbit hole where they start out with a single nugget of idea, and the more they learn from the algorithm, the deeper into the rabbit hole they go. And it's really an insidious effect, but we're really seeing it now also with Facebook and Twitter. Facebook in particular is a real problem because they've been so irresponsible about taking down extremist content, but they were a major enabler of the insurrection. A lot of the insurrection planning and stuff like that actually took place on Facebook, not on these right-wing platforms like Parler, although there was a lot of it on Parler as well. But Facebook was actually the #1 platform, and it's where we're seeing all this COVID disinformation being spread, all these attacks on school boards and health districts, and people organizing protests and invasions of state capitals and other buildings. Is all being permitted by Facebook, even while it claims that it's taking this content down. It's not taking it down effectively because they don't want to invest in the manpower that's going to be required to do this. And secondarily, the other reason they don't want to do it is that the algorithm is the engine of their profits. Yeah. So fundamentally, what Americans are faced with here is, and of course, social media is one component of this, but we also are faced with it in terms of right-wing media like Fox News, where we have corporations who are making money off of killing our democracy. And it's basically killing democracy for fun and profit. And we've got to get it. Somebody's got to do something to get it under control.
Fascism sells, right?
What?
Fascism sells right now.
Oh yeah. Partly because our memories are so bad, and we've also done such a shitty job of teaching kids history.
Great transition to my next question, which is the one that worries me the most. I don't know if you've seen, it's on Internet Archive, the recruiting video, Taking Back the Future. It's animated, and it starts with a young boy in the box of Kleenex, and then the 3 kind of like neo-Nazi.
I've seen this. No.
Oh, it's fantastically awful because it's really, really effective as a recruiting tool. It's got the right music, got the right animation, got the right images. It's Islamophobic, it's transphobic, it's homophobic. It covers all the bases without calling everything. And all you see is this young boy following these 3 buff guys that are changing society wherever they walk. And so they're constantly giving each other the thumbs up. And that ends with the dream of the 1950s MAGA dream of the heteronormative family having the backyard barbecue with neighbors, and that's the ending. And everybody who was gay or homosexual or whatever has been transformed into the norm, right? And so part of what bothers me, and Berger touches upon this in his book on extremism, and my question to you would be, is that, do you think that the future of radicalization is going to be exclusive to the recruitment of younger people through the use of things like video game forums, social media, and digital technologies, which I know is already happening, and I just referenced that one video, but I'm wondering if it's going to be like an exclusive targeting of conspiracism aimed at young people, particularly children, that the demographics going to get younger and younger as they realize that this is working more and more when they can. Because I know that 16-year-olds are being indoctrinated, and by the time they're 18, they're joining the military and they're infiltrating the military as white nationalists.
Yeah, no, the leader of Patriot Front, probably the most widespread neo-fascist organization in the United States, is a 22-year-old kid from Texas who got radicalized when he was 14 or 15. As well as I do that this has been going on since Gamergate. I think was the big opening for opening up the world of gaming to recruitment. But there's a terrific amount of recruitment that goes on in like game chat rooms on Steam and on these other platforms, when gamers just start chatting among themselves, and pretty soon you find yourself in a chat room with a guy who tells you that, you know, well, secretly Jews are controlling the world, and that's the reason for all your problems. And, you know, and then it just goes down the rabbit hole from there. And that's certainly what, I mean, that was what Gamergate was about, was providing an opening for white nationalists to start recruiting gamers who were, you know, pissed at feminists. And so they come in and say, well, yeah, you know, feminism is just cultural Marxism. And that's which is a white nationalist conspiracy theory that was, you know, promulgated by Anders Breivik, among other people. You know, they and these young kids have no idea. And so, yeah, we actually, I mean, it's been something that's been ongoing, I would say, intensely for the last 4 or 5 years, is that there's been a terrific amount of recruitment of young people through these venues. They leverage every little opening they can possibly get. And, you know, what's his name? Andrew Anglin, the guy who runs the Daily Stormer, the neo-Nazi internet rag, which fortunately now only exists in the tiniest corners of the internet, but in 2015 and 2016 was readily available to anybody, and was all over the internet. Anglin made clear that he explicitly said, I try to make my website attractive to 13-year-olds. That's the demographic I'm shooting for. I'm trying to recruit young people because that's where we change America. And I don't know how, you know, obviously being deplatformed has cut into his success rate quite a bit, but it is still happening. And I think that it's just going to get worse, especially the more we normalize this idea that what happened January 6th was just a political protest, and that these people were patriots, that they were behaving patriotically. The more that idea gets spread around, I think we're gonna see the recruitment extend to older demographics as well, and I think it's just going to intensify.
And you cover some of this in your recent Daily Kos articles. Is 2 of them that I think interconnect to this issue is the black flags that are now being put up as a sign of no quarter, like we are the ones that will eliminate you.
Yeah, we're just going to kill you. We're not. Yeah, that's what the black flags mean.
And on the other hand, the normalization, like they just had the Love Fest in LA, and you had a big Proud Boy presence, et cetera. And this is getting much more normalized.
Like Tiny was there.
And that's my point. Tiny was there, and Tiny's connected to all the stuff that we've been talking about. And yet he's out and about and enjoying his freedom and still advocating for this political insurrection. It seems to me, and a lot of people don't understand it when I say this, is, again, you're alarmist, you're kind of hyperbolic, which I don't think I am, but can you just in your own words explain to people why these groups, which you say can number in the millions in this country right now, are literally advocating for a second civil war in this country?
Well, it's because they don't want to put up with the rest of us. but yeah, but they also think that this is their moment. And they believe they have the police on their side, and to some extent they do. Certainly we have seen there's a tremendous amount of Oath Keeper membership involved with that is law enforcement. And when I was out covering these Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer events featuring Tiny Toisi and his gang of thugs out there in the streets of Portland, it was very obvious that the police were sympathetic to them and antipathetic to the people protesting them. And frankly, and they were treating, you know, it's obvious that they watched a lot of Fox News, because a lot of these people were just protesting, exercising their First Amendment right. They weren't engaging in violence or any of that. And yet the cops treated them as if just being out there protesting them was an act of violence. I think that's really problematic. I think that police culture in general is extremely problematic, and the extent of infiltration within the ranks of law enforcement by right-wing extremists is at the root of a lot of our problem. And nobody is really looking at that very hard. nobody's talking about that very much, but I think that that's got to be the first step when we talk about police reform. Is let's get rid of these extremists who have wormed their ways into our police departments, because there's a ton of them, and they're the guys. They're the guys. If they're not actually doing the prejudiced or discriminatory enforcement themselves, they're encouraging the environment in which it takes place.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, and frankly, I viewed the resistance, the police resistance to being vaccinated as a prime opportunity. It's like, hey, you fire all those guys, you're going to have half your problem solved right there.
They are almost outing themselves.
There's a Venn diagram there that's a huge amount of overlap.
They're just doxing themselves basically by not wanting to be vaccinated and their political reasons for it. And I understand it's like 1/3 of the military at this point also that's fighting the vaccination, and that's going to be a problem essentially. So I think that there's probably some overlap between their political beliefs and their anti-vaccine status. So I think that's a really good point, which connects to probably the most important chapter in the entire book is A Pill for Healing. And I know that you outline 15 steps. I think it's fantastic that you are trying to educate people, especially, a lot of families are dealing with this. A lot of partners are losing their partners or losing friends as a consequence of red pilling or falling down these rabbit holes. And you outline 15 steps, all interconnected, all very important. But I'm going to ask the awful question of asking you to pick 3 of those 15 steps that you would recommend. If you're going to walk away with anything, what would be 3 things that you would recommend people pay attention to if they are in fear of someone they love or care for falling into a red pill rabbit hole?
Yeah, and of course, I compiled these by talking to people who were in the field and do it, because I can't claim to have had any success in myself in drawing people out of these rabbit holes, but I talked to people who have. And there are a number of steps, including some that I myself violated. I don't suffer fools gladly, so I can be kind of blunt and piss people off. When I'm dealing with them interpersonally, it's like, no, what? You can't believe it. It's like, oh, you believe that? Yeah, which is exactly what you don't do. Can't do. What you actually
said, yeah, that's right.
You have to do is take an empathetic response. And those are the 3 takeaways, if I were to give them, is first to be empathetic, to spend a lot of time listening to the person even that, I would say the predicate of all this is that don't do it with just anyone. You can't do this online. Right. And it's a tremendous amount of work. It's very fraught. You have only maybe 50-50 chance of success at best. So do it very advisedly and make it be someone you care about, because that's the nub of everything that whether you're going to succeed or not, that is building that interpersonal relationship that hopefully you already have with this person, and using that as a springboard, sort of a lever to get in there and crack open that shell of unreality they've built around themselves. And so that empathetic response is really central. Being empathetic, whatever you do, don't start out trying to debunk any of this shit, because this just puts them into defense mode, gets their backs up. They immediately see you as part of the conspiracy. They and you become someone they just go so don't do that. It's key to maintaining the sort of being able to keep the dialogue going. And then once you get the dialogue going, it usually takes quite a bit of time, spending interpersonal time with the person, going, camping or bowling or whatever, doing things with them and having real interpersonal time, to the point that they start to value their relationship more with you than they do necessarily these conspiracy theories that they cling to. And it's usually somewhere in there that you can start finding little openings, usually things like well, Trump said this, but that just is not true. And you can show them how it's not true, right? Or Mike Lindell said this, or whoever is out there, Marjorie Taylor Greene, but there are always those little opportunities, and eventually you can get the conversation going to where you can actually do some actual debunking, and then you can bring them around. I mean, the key is to, I think, getting to people to recognize that they're being conned, right? And that's a really tricky thing. You can't ever, people, if you ever talk to somebody who's been the victim of a con artist, they'll be in absolute denial that they were conned, even though they've lost $1 million and just furious about it, know they've been conned, but they won't really admit it, right? And that's normal human psychology. And people just will not cop to being conned because they don't want to be that stupid, right? But ultimately, you find ways to get them to understand that you're being conned. They're having you on. You're being used, because that's the reality.
And there's residues of trauma and getting used. There's residues of trauma and all that. Hopefully, if you highlight that, the emotional impact they're left with, there might be, because what it sounds like, again, I don't actually hate to make these comparisons, because I think they're really instructive and I think valid between the work you're doing and what Robert Hare's doing in regards to psychopathy. And so one of the things that my students constantly ask me is like, well, is there any way to rehabilitate a psychopath? And my answer up until recently was no, until I started reading there's these studies emerging from Norway and some Scandinavian countries that are saying there might be a possibility, but it takes immersion and it takes catching them at a really young age. And what you do is basically you reward ethical, empathetic behavior in children that demonstrate psychopathic tendencies. And it sounds like much of what you're advocating for is like these people who fall down these rabbit holes have fallen into, ironically, and I know this is counterintuitive, these are antisocial cultures that exist that render people antisocial in their behavior. And if you want to take someone out of that, you need to re-socialize them and create these threads of empathy that then teaches them how to be human again, but a human that exists among other humans.
Exactly. The bonds of empathy are the key to all of this. Yeah, there's a whole narrative arc to the story of going down conspiracy theory rabbit holes. It starts out, there's this upward arc where they feel really empowered, they got all this secret knowledge, and then now they're connecting with other people in the same universe, and these people are praising them, and they're actually retweeting their stuff on social media, and they're, and you're making all these connections, and now you're going even further down the rabbit hole. You're making even new discoveries that win you more acclaim, whatever, or win you more tweets. And so initially it does feel very empowering. But there's sort of a zenith that it reaches where things start going sideways. Typically, there's, for one thing, the conspiracist community is filled with the most contentious, paranoid, suspicious, and just generally unpleasant people in the entire universe. And they're constantly at war with each other. They're constantly stabbing each other in the back. They're constantly getting jealous of somebody else for being more popular than they are, or what have you. And so they're constantly tearing each other down, which is a good thing.
The TRS phenomenon, right? The right stuff phenomenon.
But in the terms of when people go down the rabbit holes, this is when they first start sort of getting negative feedback. And of course, the other negative feedback that they get is in their real lives, because buying all this stuff has really profound consequences for your interpersonal relationships with people out there in the real world, including in your workplace, as well as your politics. And so you become increasingly isolated. You stop voting because you think that the whole voting system is rigged and just a joke anyway. So you basically render yourself without any political power whatsoever. And sort of the end of the narrative arc is, you know, you go off and live in the woods of northern Idaho in a cabin with a stock of rice and beans in the basement, you know, getting ready for the end of the world, and you don't trust anybody who you ever encounter. You don't trust anybody even in your own neighborhood, certainly not in your own family, because they're part of the conspiracy too.
And they've been trying to convince you otherwise. So obviously they are definitely part of the conspiracy.
It's incredibly disempowering, but it feels initially very empowering. But yes, it's at the end of the narrative arc, you're isolated, you're disempowered, and you're fundamentally a nobody.
Which is really sad, because you start off alienated, people pay attention to you for the wrong reasons, so you feel agentic, you're an agent suddenly, which raises you to the level of hero. Now you're part of this like superhero club that tells you that go do your superhero thing alone. You go right back to alienated, and yet somehow you have this artificial connection to this artificial group that is advocating for you, but there's no real substance behind it. There's no lived conditions of reality that on a daily basis reinforce that identity or that sense of belonging, because as you said, the end result is you living alone in the cabins with like 10 ARs and, you know, a stock of rice and beans, waiting for the Civil War to come, and watching a lot of YouTube videos and following a lot of tweets to make sure they announce it correctly. Because, you know, like,
well, I mean, and you don't watch your football team anymore because one of those players kneeled.
Well, that's it. Yeah.
You know, I mean, everything's gone.
Everything except the anthem and the flags.
Everything. Yeah. So it's pretty interesting dynamic. And, you know, and I really I've seen so many families get torn up and just destroyed by this shit. So.
And you've been extremely generous with your time. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I just have like yes or no questions you can answer really quickly. Is critical race theory the new cultural Marxism?
Yeah, which is the new political correctness.
Right.
Which actually is the new protocols of the Seven Elders of Zion.
Which I didn't know that Henry Ford basically got published and allowed the translation to end up in Hitler's hands. It went from Henry Ford to Hitler's hands.
Hitler's, he was, well, this is the reason that Hitler awarded him the Iron Cross, you know.
This is America. Okay, so hey, thank you for that. Does Kevin McDonald actually understand the Frankfurt School? Because I read Culture of Critique. I'm like, I don't think he understands the Frankfurt School.
Neither does James Lindsay or any of these guys.
Right.
No, well, that's the key to a lot of conspiracism, is that they completely distort and wildly mischaracterize all kinds of stuff, including especially the stuff that's central to their conspiracy theories, like the Frankfurt School. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting academic school. It did not influence the course of Western civilization. It had a noteworthy effect in some circles of academia, but it was, you know, I mean, these guys try to claim that cultural Marxism originated multiculturalism, which is total horseshit. Multiculturalism arose from anthropology, primarily, you know, it was out of Columbia, which is where the Frankfurt School moved to. And it was, primarily Jewish scholars who came up with the idea of multiculturalism, but it was not a Jewish plot. So
it's not like they talk about the fact that most of them came to the United States because they were escaping Nazi persecution as Jewish intellectuals in Germany at the time. Like that part just is left out.
And then they did return to Frankfurt.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and Adorno was very conservative.
They're influential, but they're not. They didn't set the course of Western civilization, and it was not their intent. I mean, one of the really funny things about this is that they portray the Frankfurt School academics as being the reason we have so much permissiveness in modern cultural, in films and music and so on and so forth, that they're responsible for this modern permissive society. But actually the Frankfurt School was incredibly critical of all that stuff. They were like, this is bad for us, I mean, that was they're the important critique of modern culture that's there in the Frankfurt School.
Extremely. I mean, Adorno,
exactly the opposite way that these guys describe it.
totally. I mean, they were one of the first ones to critique the harmful psychological effects of canned laughter in movies and things and television, because it's like that kills humor, it kills the dynamic behind it. So yeah, they hope. I don't know if Kevin, if you're watching, there's a whole section on the culture industry. Did Kevin pass away?
No, he's still alive.
Okay, Kevin, I doubt he'll watch it, but yeah, read the part of the culture industry that they're really against everything you think they're in favor of. All right, one last question, Dave, a positive one. Of Orca and Men, what can we learn from killer whales that maybe gets us out of this whole mess?
It actually has real bearing on this.
I was about to say,
I'm so glad you asked this, because I was going to end with it anyway.
Okay.
It seems very often, and I started writing about killer whales in the early 90s, but I was an environmental reporter when I first started doing this stuff, and I was writing about militias in the 90s as a environmental backlash story, and that was how I first started. I mean, they'd been in my news reportage as a daily newsroom staffer for the previous 15 years.
Fascinating.
But there wasn't a focused subject. But I was an environmental reporter, and I started writing about them, and I wound up being one of the only guys who had gone out and interviewed militiamen in the woods prior to Oklahoma City. Oh. And so after Oklahoma City, I had a ton of media appearances as a militia expert. I'm just a journalist, people, but at least I was able to shed some light on that stuff. And I already had a relationship with the SPLC people dating back to my newspaper years, but I began working with them a lot more. And a guy who did a lot of the organizing in the Northwest, his name was Bill Wasmuth, talked me into making it a dedicated beat, because he convinced me that one of the problems that most of the people in civil rights work and have with journalists is that they tend to just parachute into these stories and don't have the historic background. So somebody who has sort of the historic contextual understanding is extremely valuable to them. So I decided to be that person. And so, but I had moved out here to the Seattle area in the early 90s, actually in 89, and decided, and I was starting to freelance in about 92, and I knew that these killer whales were just a fascinating story, because they kind of represented everything, so much of the Northwest environmental issues story, the lack of salmon and toxins in the water and everything else. So I started writing about them then, and such a fascinating story, I just kept with it, and I kept doing a lot of freelance stories over the years. After I wrote And Hell Followed With Her, I have to tell you that book left me hollowed out. It was really an emotionally difficult story to write, because covering those trials and seeing the evidence and where they blew this little girl's face off just really devastated me. She was the same age as my daughter. They killed her on my daughter's birthday.
Oh,
and wow. And so I felt that I really felt empathetic to the mother, who was there for every day of the trial. So it was I was just an emotional wreck at the time. That by the time I was done, I felt like I'd been hollowed out by the toxic nature of what I've been writing about. And
collateral damage.
I was to write my Orca book. I'd had it in the back of my mind for a long time, putting together all the material that I put together over the years, writing freelance articles, but also more because everything picked up right about the same time the movie Blackfish came out. And that, I think, really piqued interest in killer whales. And so basically I was providing, the full story I wanted to explain the full story of killer whales and why they're an important species and why our relationship with them is important. And also why they're the coolest animals on the planet, because they are.
It's hard to argue.
A part of why they're the coolest animal on the planet is that, I mean, they have been lords of the ocean for 6 million years. I mean, they are the apex species in the oceans, and really, which is for most of Earth's history, or for the last 6 million years. That's that's the largest portion of the planet that they are the rulers of. And they're the most successful species. They're really counterparts to humans in many, many ways, including that they are far and away the most intelligent species out there in the water. And they're not significantly more intelligent than bottlenose dolphins, but they are more intelligent than them. And they have the most gyrified brains. They're the second largest brain, most gyrified brain on the planet, which means that they have more neuron lengths and everything else. Incredibly intelligent species. They have their own languages and their own cultures. And one of the things that in studying them that I sort of twigged onto is that fundamental to orca culture is empathy. They survive because they are profoundly empathetic to not only each other, but to others, other species out there in the water. Not necessarily their prey.
I was about to say, don't they play volleyball with seals?
Even then, it's pretty remarkable how killer whales try to make, when they kill things, seem to deal fairly merciful deaths. They're very swift about it. Although chasing, when they chase young humpbacks, it can take hours and it's grueling. So, but otherwise, yeah, like when they kill sharks, it's just boom, boom, you're dead. Now let's tear your liver out.
Is that why they toss the seals? It's a quick kill. It's not volleyball.
It is a quick kill. It renders them unconscious. And
So
it may actually kill them. Okay. We're not sure. All we know is that we recover the carcass, they're very dead.
So empathy, you would say.
Yeah. So part of my thesis is that one of the things we really can learn from them is that, we tend to think of empathy as a vulnerability, as a liability, sort of in our ability to survive. And for them, empathy is foundational to everything they do. And they are profoundly empathetic. Those big giant brains that I'm talking about, one of the aspects of it is that they use those brains for echolocation. And they not only are able to share each other's signals when they create an echolocation signal that goes out into the water, but what enables them to see, of course, is the bounce back that comes back from it. And they all share in the bounce back, so they can all see what each other's doing. When they live with their families for their entire lives, and they don't just see each other in the water, they see inside each other. Their echolocation provides them with essentially a sort of sonogram of what they're looking at. So when one of the members is pregnant, or one of them is sick, or one of them has anything going on, they all know because they can all see inside. And I talked to a brain neurologist who said that this has to have a really powerful effect on their cultural lives, their social lives, because it means that their sense of self is inextricably bound up with each other in ways that we could barely even comprehend. We can't even comprehend. So for killer whales, empathy is really a foundational trait, and it is essential. It's an evolutionary trait, and it's also one that's basically essential for their long-term survival. It's a lot of the reason that they have been lords of the ocean and have survived so successfully as a species for 6 million years.
Fascinating.
And we've only been around 200,000.
Wow.
So
lot to learn.
And we're already fucking up the planet.
Yeah, and we're taking them with us, ironically.
Yeah.
Who's smarter? And that's so. I just want to confirm, because this is fascinating to me. The thing that we are socialized into thinking is a vulnerability, our empathy, right? And
Mhm.
especially hyper masculine cultures that we're raised in, it's like you
Right.
don't want to be the weak link. You want to be stronger. You want to
Right.
strive to be the alpha. And if you can't be an alpha, be a good beta so that you're at least included in the club. What
Correct.
you're saying is that killer whales actually teach empathy as a strength, as
That's
one of their positive characteristics, which reminds me, and I hate to be corny about this,
patriarchal culture too, by the way.
it can't get away from one or the other usually. But what I find interesting is that it functions very much, and the idea of like that the self is tied to the group and they can see each other. I hate to be crazy or corny about this, but it sounds like you're describing the Force and Jedis and a culture of people that exist with a relationship to each other, where what they feel is this thing called the Force, but what we call it is empathy. If you can empathize with the things, including objects, including the natural environment, including the living species and things that surround you as not just things, but as extensions of life, then your relationship to empathy will become a strength as opposed to a social weakness.
Yeah, I think the key there is that for killer whales, the empathy is founded not just on sort of feelings as they are for humans, but it's founded on sensory input. You know, this echolocation sense that they have is just incredibly powerful, and it's the reason they have such large brains. That's what most of the brains are dedicated to doing, is performing the echolocation function.
You need an audiobook that one day. Seriously, that would be a great one. I think that'd be a great seller.
Well, I really enjoyed writing that book. It was the first book I didn't have to be dead serious writing. I have a sense of humor, and I like
you do. I see it in the other works.
My life, but I can't ever put it into my books because I mean, you can. There's some wry humor in the extremist book, mostly because they do such crazy shit that you have to laugh sometimes.
Yeah. It's the MASH syndrome, right? If I got to operate and laugh.
It's kind of nasty humor, and the Orca book let me do just my usual dry and warm humor. And so I got to be more myself in that book than any of my others.
Well, along those lines, did you know, Dave, that the original pure Aryans were telepathic, and therefore their sense of empathy was extraordinary, I would assume, right?
Or are we talking about the Iranians?
Yeah, exactly.
The original Aryans, you know.
The original Aryans.
That's what Iran is a bastardization of Aryan, you know.
Is that why it's closer to Tibet than, you know, Europe and the rest?
Yeah, no, the place that the Aryan people were believed to originate from was northern Iran. So yeah, those Persians were white. That was why 300. You ever see 300? Yeah. Such a mind-blowingly bad movie, but especially because it made the Persians out to be a bunch of black people.
Seriously, yeah, and they have to speak really weird. They got all this jewelry. Whereas the Spartans, you know, are Fossenbender and all these great looking guys. It's like, they're these great white guys, except for the disabled one who's like,
and he's the traitor.
No empathy for them. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
just
he
a little
was
bit.
The villain. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, that was just one of the worst movies ever.
Body types are important.
Really look good.
I think Jon Stewart called it like the ab movies. Just a bunch of guys with abs everywhere. It's like when he had them back when the Daily Show was a thing. Yeah. Well, Dave, your sense of humor is very present, and it can be sensed. So I really appreciate that you bring that. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast. Thank you for fighting the good fight. Believe it or not, a lot of us are paying attention. A lot of us are taking your work and trying to disseminate it to younger people so that they know what to look out for, so that they know how to protect themselves. Yes. And more importantly, how to resist this accelerationist / eliminationist moment we're living in history, and just push back against it. And I think you raised one of the key issues. It's like, make empathy one of your strengths, and then use it to try to appeal to those people that are at least their neurons are still there and available for access.
Be empathetic with each other too. I get dismayed by the extent of infighting that happens among the people who are opposing this, partly because we all want to think we're exactly right, and the other person's your nuance is wrong, and I don't find that helpful. And I just think it's important to let's be empathetic with each other.
We don't have to
Yeah.
be heroes. We can all just be equal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
If people want to get in contact with you or find you, Dave, I know they already know that you write for the Daily
Very
Post.
easy. A couple ways. I am on Twitter, but I only allow DMs for my followers. But you can always. I have an email at Daily Kos. There's a link there to any of my stories at Daily Kos that will put you in touch with me. It's just dave.neiwert@dailykos.com. And anybody who wants to write me, I'm very accessible.
He and I got to vouch for that. Very accessible, very professional, extremely nice person. So
Except I'm wearing my T-shirt today. So.
if you're interested, well, you're not sitting in front of a crowd with a microphone in your hand. Otherwise, I'm sure you would have put on the suit and the whole thing that I've seen you do on YouTube, ironically. Anyway,
Yeah. I just rather be myself.
Yeah, no, which I actually enjoy. I tell my students I have to put this on as camouflage in order to neutralize the radicalism of my ideas.
When I was a newsroom manager, when I was an editor, a news editor, I always wore a monkey suit. So
you got to put the monkey suit on.
I don't have to now.
You don't have to brag about it. Anyway, Dave, anything you're working on right now? Just out of curiosity.
I'm working actually on a proposal that my agent is selling for a book about the coming insurgency. Working title is Beyond the Rubicon, and something like the Radical Rights War on Democracy.
Okay, all right. So I'm writing on that stuff, but I'm trying to use like movies as symptoms of the fact that it's going on in culture. So I might hit you up with an email or two just to like have a conversation about the psychopathy accelerationist overlap that seems to happen. So
yes,
again, thank you very much. Love Baby Yoda in the background. Love your new office.
That's Grogu.
That's right, Grogu. I always call him Baby Yoda. I got to the episode. I know the name. I just like Baby Yoda better. And we don't know what he'll be called in the future.
Who knows?
Exactly. They might change the name. Yoda might be the moniker. I mean, everybody's
called who knows? Yoda. I mean, hell, they had Mark Hamill show up.
Which was a really young Mark Hamill. I'm surprised. He did a lot of great makeup.
Yeah, how do you do that?
I wasn't expecting that. And I kind of liked it, but I couldn't put it in the time frame of the movies. I was like, well, I guess that's after Return of the Jedi, I guess.
Exactly. It's between Return of the Jedi and then the follow-ups.
Yeah, they're gonna have a lot of explaining to do of why we don't see Mandalorians in the rest of the franchise outside of a bounty hunter who's not a Mandalorian. That's gonna be I don't think they're gonna do it, but anyway. Again, thanks, Dave. Nice meeting you. Hope I'm very much looking forward to your new book. Any ETA and when it'll come out next year, hopefully?
It's probably gonna be late next year.
Okay.
I don't think I'm gonna get the manuscript done before March or April.
Hurry up, Dave. We're looking forward to it. Okay. Well, thank you. Have a nice one. Good luck with today's game. Sorry about your quarterback situation.
Yeah. Well, that's what happens. But
yeah,
it's not going to be their year. The Seahawks.
Oh no, it's Arizona or Los Angeles at this point. Yeah, so sure, you gotta love it. Anyway, well, thanks again, Dave. And
all right, take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that'll do it for today's episode of The Identity Paradox. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I definitely found it very instructive, and we'll definitely see you next time. Thanks again.
Oh, and don't forget to please subscribe to future episodes if you enjoyed today's. Thanks.